Welcome to Petronoia, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the energy debate. Hosted by Dan Romito, this show takes complex energy issues, strips away the agendas, and delivers clear fact-based insights. Whether you're an industry expert or simply looking for a balanced perspective, Petronoia brings clarity to the conversation. Each episode, Dan breaks down key topics, from U.S. energy independence to global policy impacts, focusing on the facts rather than the rhetoric, helping listeners make sense of the energy landscape. This is Petronoia, where we separate fact from fiction to fuel-informed discussions.
Welcome to Petronoia. I'm Dan Romito. I'm here with my new friend, Deb Ryan. She's running points on Swan Mountain Advisory. She's based in Denver. We had to get this thing going. We were starting to prep before we hit record. I'm like, man, let's just record. Like, this is all really good stuff. So Deb, we were introduced in Denver by our friend, the one and only Bobby Stout, the man, the consigliere, as I like to say. He introduced me, as only Bob could, as you have to meet this person who's just like you, except that she's a female, she's from Australia, she has unique hair, she's an engineer. And I'm like, Bob, I'm none of those things. Like, and he's like, no, but you guys are basically the same person. I'm like, okay. So like, I have to meet Deb. And then we actually spoke, and you were nice enough to have me on your podcast. And I'm like, Deb's awesome. I got to have her on mine. So with that being the introduction, would love to sort of get like, how did you get here? Like, what are you working on? And then, we'll dive right into it.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think Bob said something similar to me before you and I met as well, and so we've definitely got a lot of things in common in terms of, I think, how we view the world,
Right.
particularly on energy and carbon and things like that.
So you were like, Bob, I'm not a total meathead, so like maybe.
And I don't live in Florida, and it's
Exactly.
anyway.
Sorry.
A few minor differences is fine. So yeah, so I've had an interesting journey because I'm a petroleum engineer by background, and I cut my teeth working for Woodside, like running around on offshore oil rigs, and by running around, walking very carefully, holding the handrail on offshore oil rigs.
Health and safety people freak out.
Yeah. And actually went to Libya to do some work there when that was still a thing. I was there in 2008, which was kind of a wild time. Yeah, that was kind of wild. And then I pivoted and I went and worked in unconventionals. Again, early unconventionals. I was doing coal bed methane in Queensland. And that was when I started coming out to the US. I was doing reserves I was the head of reserves for that company. And started coming out here and working with the reserve auditors that we were working with at the time. And I eventually joined one. I moved here to Denver in 2012, and I've been here ever since. And joined a consulting firm to do upstream oil and gas work. And again, not just reserves, but regulatory. We did a lot of litigation support. We did a lot of teaching. I would just be the reservoir engineer for different small companies and things like that. And so really got to see lots of different aspects of not just domestic US oil and gas, but we worked for clients all over the world. So it was really cool. But in 2018, I started becoming quite outspoken about the fact that industry needed to do better.
Was there something that sort of triggered that, or is this sort of like woke up one morning and you're like, I just had this epiphany? Or just
Well, so in 2018, for those that were here in Colorado at the time in industry, the new Polis administration, so Jared Polis was voted in as the governor. He had promised oil and gas at the Colorado Oil and Gas Association event 6 months prior that he wouldn't do anything. And literally like within a month, there was a ballot initiative here in the state government around setbacks, which was that they were going to restrict any oil and gas development from pretty much anything by 2,500 feet. And it pretty much ruled out oil and gas development in the state. And I think a lot of people are actually not familiar with this, but Weld County in the northern part of Colorado is still, we're in 2025 now, like it's still like the fourth or fifth, maybe fifth now, largest producing county in the country. Like it produces a huge amount of oil and gas. So it's a huge industry here. So, and I kept hearing from people in particularly in Denver. But like, it's not fair. Like, there was at the time, the Permian in particular was flaring like a BCF of gas a day. And everyone here in Colorado kept being like, well, it's not fair. Like, that's not us. And I was like, we are all part of the same industry. And as long as that's happening in Texas and other parts of the country, we are all painted with the same brush. And the public hates us and we need to do better. And so that was kind of what triggered it. It was like, how do we have a different conversation around what we do? And yeah, like that's sort of led me to where I am now to a certain extent. But I ended up joining. I took a job with S&P Global within the Platts division at the time, and kind of completely pivoted where I was heading up the carbon markets and the carbon intensity emissions analytics teams.
Yeah.
So looking at industry through a different lens, like how do we estimate emissions from upstream oil and gas and LNG and fuels and stuff like that. And so it's been an interesting journey from there. And it's sort of, I confuse people in that regard. Like, so we can get into that and talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, it's been a really good journey.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, once again, we were talking about this, like you have industry, oil and gas, you have sort of the clean tech, which I know is a little bit of a broad definition, but more or less, like when we talk about clean tech, we understand, there's a little bit of renewables, there's a little bit of like detection technology. It's sort of like the smorgasbord. And then you have sort of like the environmental bros, the NGOs, right? And, I like to joke, it's like the Bloods, the Crips, and the Latin Kings, right? It's like, and we have to figure out how to sort of make peace with one another. Each group, and we can get into that later, sort of has like their shortcomings. But overall, I would say there is this sort of convergence, at least on a common denominator of understanding. Like you're also doing the adjunct professor thing. So from a teaching standpoint, do you think it's getting better, like the convergence between those groups, or is it still just remain turf wars for our lifetime?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of, like my non-overlapping Venn diagram of these groups of like, how do we figure out like what are the common things that we can all agree on? Because industry, and particularly in 2018, and I've seen this permeate a lot, industry can be quite condescending in terms of like, well, you need us, you need oil and gas, and so we're going to keep doing what we're doing. That rhetoric has changed a little bit since 2018, but it's still there. And that then makes all the other groups be like, like we're going to fight these guys. And yeah, and then you've got like the clean tech groups. Again, some of it's physical tech, some of it's data and things like that. But like, and a lot of these folks, and this is where I advise a number of companies in that kind of space, both around like methane data and carbon markets and stuff like that, where they're out of Boulder, Colorado, or they're out of San Francisco, and that's where some of the funding and the money is coming from. And yet they're trying to work with industry, and whether that's oil and gas or refining or just it doesn't matter. But they don't know anybody in industry. They don't necessarily like industry in some circumstances, like. And so there's this interesting tension where they need industry to scale and to make their technologies and data and stuff successful. So there's an interesting tension there. And then on the carbon side, with the environmental folks and the nonprofits, either running carbon registries or developing carbon credits, or even on the sort of like broader like UN and the EDFs and some of those folks who hate industry. And that becomes a very tense us and them, right? Where I think because industry was quite like aggressive in terms of you need us, like go away, instead of figuring out how to work together, then we've got a lot of the carbon folks being like, well, we're going to regulate you out of business. And some of that tension still exists, and that's really challenging. And I've seen it very specifically in the last few months shift pretty quickly, where initially, I left S&P over a year ago, and I've been doing consulting advisory since. And initially, when I was talking about some of this, everyone was like, that's kind of weird. Like, what do you want to do? And now everyone's like, oh, you're like in the thick of this because of the shift back to the conversation, particularly around AI, but broadly the conversation in the US around just energy and how do we keep energy production affordable for folks and stuff, whether that is when you fill your car up or, turn your lights on in your house. And so there has been a little bit of a shift back. So I think we are starting to break through a little bit.
Yep.
But you talk about
exactly in the sense that sort of like more reasonable minds, more reasonable voices, more reasonable perspectives are emerging.
well, I think there's starting to be a willingness to work together, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think, we saw this past week, like the Net Zero Banking Alliance folded, which was a big, and my LinkedIn feed was mixed about the opinions on that. Again, because I've got a mixed network and stuff around that, so that's an example where like some of these initiatives that were stood up that, a lot of people, particularly in industry, were like, that goes too far, are starting to be pulled back. And like, so it's like, okay, how do we find some of these reasonable balances around stuff? Um, you talked about the student perspective, and I would say both the student perspective and also like when I go and speak at different conferences and events, it's kind of really interesting. Like so I'm an adjunct professor at CU Denver, and I teach a carbon markets for business class as part of the JP Morgan Commodity Center. So I get a really interesting mix of students where I get some students have oil and gas backgrounds. Some students have renewables backgrounds. I've had like auditors and like economists and stuff who are maybe in an oil and gas company or energy adjacent and stuff. And they're, anyway, so it's a really interesting mix of folks. And I say this again to the students in the first week, whenever we come in and, they'll introduce themselves and have their really interesting backgrounds. And I'm like, I don't really care about people's views on climate change. Like, this isn't like, I know that's very political and stuff. I was like, but the way that we are doing business is changing. And, carbon markets is a market at the end of the day. And there's a lot of people that have figured out how to make a lot of money in some of these spaces. I was at a conference a number of years ago, and one of the guys at the back of the room was like, can we all just agree that we've all made a lot of money from EUAs this year? And like, it's a European allowances because they were going through the roof and everyone was trading on the secondary market. Like, so it's like, there is money to be made in this space. And I think it's, if we start putting things in terms of cash flow and business and financial and economic decisions, I think in my view, we can start to align on some of these things. And it really brings in like the work I used to do around reserves and cash flow and how companies make decisions on where they're going to drill a well or if they're going to recomplete a well or whatever. If we can start rolling in like, well, then how do companies make decisions on what technology or where they're going to apply different technology on a decarbonization point of view? I think we're not seeing it yet. It's quite nascent, but like price realization and stuff in the market around low carbon solutions is starting to gain some traction. And there's lots of different reasons for that. But if we start looking at this a little bit different, it's kind of interesting. And it sort of does then definitely shape the conversations that I have, both in the classroom, but also and again, I go and present at a lot of oil and gas events. And I've had organizers who I know quite well be like, well, you're not going to be anti-industry, are you? I'm like, dude, I'm still in industry. No. And again, it's that same thing of like the way that we are doing business is changing. Here's some of the ways that's happening. And I still get these lovely little like handwritten letters from like old white guys in Texas who are like, climate change isn't real. I'm like, I didn't say climate change. I didn't say anything about climate change, but like,
yeah, I think the market, maybe there's some dissonance on my behalf and I'm projecting a little bit, but I'm just so over the climate change debate. I'm so over like I've so much ESG fatigue. I don't even like the E word. I don't like the C word. All things like idealistic. I'm just not into it anymore. I was never into it, but I'm just sick of hearing it. Your point on analyzing everything or presenting everything through the lens of business, like to me, that's the most sensible way to go. It's like, guys, this is how an economy works. You have to make money, and then you take that money you make and then you allocate it in a manner where you make more money. Like that's just how the system goes. And so, if you want to have this debate against, capitalism or the merits of capitalism versus any other economic system, once again, read a 5th grade history book. Like, capitalism is the best. It does facilitate that. So you have to have, it's a very long-winded way of saying, you have to have very healthy industry in order to improve best practices. The argument that, and you say it perfectly, like to angle the argument of get rid of industry, it's like, do you like roads? Do you like medicine? Do you like refrigeration? Do you like air conditioning? Do you like shoes? do you like your iPhone? And everyone's like, yeah. And it's like, then you can't get rid of the industry. And like, it used to drive me crazy. Like I would probably need like a horse tranquilizer to really calm myself down after talking. But now it's sort of like the indication that, oh, like, okay, you just don't get it. And that's not condescending. It's like, well, let's like just walk through what this is. And simultaneously, there's oil and gas executives in our business where, man, I thought I was going to have to really talk about horse tranquilizers, like get some Uber horse tranquilizer from Juarez, just calm down. But some of the points that you make were actually really, really good. And where I'm going with this is people have a really hard time acknowledging change. Like the industry has fundamentally changed, right? Case in point, would love your perspective on LNG. Like the irony of LNG is, it will be interesting, but Europeans want US LNG, but they want it to know simultaneously that is within the realm of reason, I think, the lowest carbon intense molecule. So that does provide, from a business perspective, a real nice competitive differentiator. It's like, here's some LNG, but it's also the lowest carbon intense molecule, which we can do. And oh, by the way, like if the world's energy market, or if the energy market is a global market, which it is, the US sort of has to acknowledge that there's this world thing going on. Like, how are you seeing that evolve in your practice?
So the LNG piece is something I've been pretty focused on for a while. And you're absolutely right. Like I talked about how some of these like market mechanisms and particularly price differentiation are really starting to kind of come into sort of reality with what that looks like. Because again, if you can spend some capital, and in this case to measure and monitor your methane, and you get a reward for that, then you're at least companies can then make a balanced decision around, well, how much capital do I spend for how much reward, and vice versa. The European import regulations that dictate that all fossil fuels, but LNG, the gas supply chain has really sort of seen the front of that, need to have their methane associated with the imports into Europe quantified through MMRV, so measurement, I always forget the second M, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and validation, verification. And so when the administration changed earlier this year and, the EPA started talking about rolling back all these things and taking away the methane fee or the WACC from the IRA, again, a lot of people on my LinkedIn feed and talking to people in industry were like, oh, we don't have to do this crap anymore. And I'm like, yeah, you do. Because if you want to sell your gas to Cheniere or any of the LNG groups, they're going to require it. And gas is also an interesting thing because obviously you just put gas into a pipeline and it comes out the other end. And so we're seeing this evolution of like environmental instruments and stuff. It's a little bit like the guarantees of origin with power, same kind of, we've seen this before. The challenge on the trading side for the gas piece in terms of the price differentiation is that because gas has to meet a pipeline spec to be moved around the country, yeah, like gas isn't used to trading on attribute differentials like oil is. And so there's a learning curve for the gas traders around like, okay, well, how do we price differently because of quality, and a quality that's like not measured? Whereas the oil traders are very familiar with that, right? Like depending on what your API of your crude is, your sulfur content of your crude is, you get a certain price. So there's a lot of stuff that still needs to happen. But I would say broadly, what's ended up happening is that a lot of the methane directives and things that have been in place that companies are doing around how to make sure they reduce and make sure they have the right certifications around their upstream production, none of that's kind of stopped, whether the EPA requires people to report it or not. So it's been a really interesting kind of like, a lot of companies are just like, they might not be talking about it as much as they were like 18 months ago, but they're still doing it. And that's important.
I agree with that. I think people lose their minds, at least initially, and they're like, the EPA is getting rid of all this stuff. And it's like, well, hold on. Like, maybe we can improve best practices without incurring the cost of compliance, right? If you're, once again, there's only so much capital to go around. So if you're going to allocate cost to compliance, like, well, there's only a limited amount of resources to go around for innovative R&D, right? So like this notion of trade-offs, I think, has to be entered into the mix. It's like there is no silver bullet that gives you 100% of your want. And I would make the arguments, and I would love your feedback or even pushback on it. Like, without going political, the Biden administration completely went overboard on the regulatory side. Like, I make this joke, I've made it 1,000 times, but if the government said, hey, the first one to figure out how to go net zero, for example, and do it in a way where it can be verified and trusted, blah, 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 you never have to pay taxes again. Do you know who would be the first one to go net zero? Exxon. Like, you know, like, so the incentive structure, I think, once again, it's fascinating to me to see how the carrot sort of, or what the carrot experience is, as opposed, because we know like the beat over the head with the tax, just you can't tax your way into solutions, as I like to say. I almost go to like a much more cynical place on the quality perspective. And I tie it together with the tech bros. Like, my argument is that we can't do tech bro stuff without natural gas, at least for the foreseeable future, like for the next decade, whatever it may be, until we figure out how to scale nuclear. Like, it is natural gas. And tech bros like have this sort of diminishing euphoria around generative AI, because actually one of our analysts, we lovingly call her JK, her name's Johanna, just did like this masterpiece 20-page paper on sort of the adverse risks of data centers. Like, these things are monstrosities, and they suck up a ton of power, they utilize a bunch of energy, and now there's becoming a political hot button because of all this pushback, because of the data center's impact on emissions, wastewater, land, you know, cost of electricity, all the above. And I actually think it's going to ironically come from the tech bro community to say, we need to know your emissions, because number one, we promised the world, including the capital markets, that we're going to go to net zero. We're not even going to come close. So that also highlights or underscores the need for the carbon markets, and we'll touch upon that. Number two, we don't even know what our emissions profile is. Like, we think we know, we don't know. And like, if we thought that, no offense, love you, but if we thought that there's an anal retentive group of engineers in the oil and gas space, like the tech bros, like they have to know, like their minds explode if they don't know. They are just wired to I want to know. And the third thing is, we're sort of seeing this in Memphis, like with the Tesla thing, but lawsuits. Like, a data center is inevitably going to be sued, and if they don't have the material or the information or certainly the data to counter whatever they're being accused of, and I think emissions would be on that. I actually think it's going to be water, but emissions is going to be, you know, 1B or 2. Yeah. They're going to want that data. So the long-winded ranted point is, whether it comes from regulation or whether it comes from incentive or whether it becomes from a partner who, oh, by the way, is going to dictate the future prowess of the U.S. economy, you're going to have to get the data. It's just going to have to be in place.
One of the really big challenges around emissions data is that, and I think we're getting better at it, that emissions are calculated. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. Yeah, it's spreadsheet math right now. And again, you made the point when we were at the event a few weeks ago or a month ago now, whenever it was, that, you know, like people filling in their EPA spreadsheets and sending them off to the government, like some of that data is not great. And it's not. You know, the emissions factors that are being used are just, you know, they're just that. They're factors. People put stuff in and send it off. The piece there's a couple of pieces that are really important in that, though, so that we can all start talking the same language. And it's around, how do we improve that data? And there's a lot of work happening. And again, I advise a company in this space around, how do we quantify emissions? And, you know, we can measure some things. We still have to then calculate methane or CO2 and stuff from that, whether it's infrared or, you know, concentrations of methane that have to be converted back and things like that. But it is improving, and it's improving quickly. And I wrote a piece on Substack recently around data. I'm an engineer. I love data, and I like the tech bros. I love data. They love data. I love data. But it will improve. And like back in the day, production data wasn't measured very well, right? Like, you know, I've talked about bucket tests before. Like, to measure water back in the day, someone would take a bucket and a watch, probably wasn't a stopwatch, but like, and they would say, okay, how quickly can I fill that bucket? Volume over time is rate. And that's the rate for the month. And that's what was reported to the state back in the day. So we're sort of on a similar path with emissions around like, okay, we've got to start somewhere. As we continue to report, stuff will improve. The technology is constantly improving. And through that, then we also need to figure out, how do we standardize? Again, emissions are calculated. How do we standardize emissions calculations, both for assets, but actually more importantly for products, which is an interesting differentiation. And oil,
So what do you mean? So by products, like what do you mean?
so like oil, gas, like the individual products that,
Okay.
fuel, like, or diesel or whatever. Because like an individual wellhead, so when you talk about like the emissions from a well, if you want the well itself, you're going to talk about everything that goes on with that well, and it's an asset level. And so like the state report, the EPA data, like a lot of these emissions trading schemes and stuff like that are at an asset level. Like, what does that well, what does that refinery, what does that building emit?
Yeah.
But an oil and gas well produces oil and gas and water.
Right.
And so how do you allocate emissions to that gas that then comes out of a wellhead, goes through a pipeline, and goes to a power plant to power AI? How do you allocate the emissions through that? Because it changes, at the wellhead, you've got to figure out what's oil, what's water. Maybe it gets separated out, it gets like liquids taken out of it, the pipeline's a different piece. So like we need consistent frameworks to be able to say that molecule of gas that was delivered to that data center or to that LNG facility or wherever has a carbon intensity of this or an emissions value of this. And we've all agreed that this is how we're going to calculate it. Because at the moment, everyone's using sort of different methodologies and different stuff. When it arrives at that data center and the tech companies are trying to figure out, like, what does this even mean?
Right.
Like, they might get stuff from 3 or 4 different groups and it might mean different things. And that in and of itself is useless. So there's a huge evolution that needs to go on in terms of how do we standardize emissions calculations? And again, how do we differentiate what is calculated at an asset level versus the products that flow through that? Like a refinery, right, produces all these different products. And yet when we talk about like the International Maritime Organization and IMO, you've got to understand what that means from a product level for what's being produced. So it's partly why this is so contentious right now, because nobody knows what the hell is going anywhere. Or how do you calculate it?
Well, begs the question, like, who creates the framework? Not, I could be convinced, but it would take like a long time and probably a couple beers to convince me that it should be government, because clearly just watching them fumble through like the waste emissions charge and subpart W and all these other things, it's like, you guys kind of get it, but not really. Industry is sort of the same thing. Like, I mean, it was just natural human tendency for like to game the system to the greatest extent you could. So where's like a moral hazard sort of come into play, right? Like the consummate, well, we're going to under promise and over deliver. And it's like, well, that's not really the point. If Deb Ryan was appointed ruler of the universe for a couple of days, who would you sort of look to run point on that framework?
It's a really good question, because and it's a challenging one. The thing that I've been hearing a lot about recently, and which is kind of interesting, is the International Maritime Organization, the IMO.
And where are they based? I'm not even familiar with, so I wanted to Google them after this.
Yeah, I have no idea where their head office is, but the thing about and CORSIA or the ICAO, there's so many acronyms in this space.
Yeah.
So ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO has their CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reducing Scheme for International Aviation or something. There's so many acronyms, it's ridiculous. And then the IMO is the International Maritime Organization.
Okay.
Given that ships and planes are global, by those kind of organizations setting standards of saying, like, this is how we are going to expect aircraft and ships to calculate the carbon intensity of the fuels that they burn, whether that is diesel, methanol, SAF, LNG, like we're talking about LNG ships and stuff like that. Everybody else, doesn't matter if you're in the US, it doesn't matter if you're in Asia, it doesn't matter if you're in Europe, is going to have to be like, oh, this is how I do that. So there's an element there, and it's not to say that they necessarily should be the ones doing it, but they have a really interesting role to play in that space where like it will align people. And I'm hearing more and more around methanol, like from a natural gas perspective, natural gas is a feedstock for methanol.
Right.
And that's one of the things that's actually, even though it's a really small market, it's actually like where companies and oil and gas companies are starting to hear noise around, like methanol producers are starting to care about the carbon intensity of the gas they're buying because they have to then disclose it to IMO. And I think with the lessons learned I've had around this as well, a lot of the carbon intensity estimates and stuff that have come out from upstream oil and gas, which is great that people like the fact that Darren Woods can get on a stage and talk about what the carbon intensity of their operations is would not have happened 2 years ago. So like we've made huge steps in that. But upstream oil and gas putting it out there and saying this is what it is one thing. But actually, as soon as you have a demand for something, it changes the whole game. So it sort of has to be the demand side that is dictating what they want so that then upstream can, can then deliver that. Whether that's physical attributes, low sulfur or, an API of a crude or, whatever it is, or if it's carbon intensity or methane intensity. So that has a really interesting role to play. The other thing I would say is that like, I don't think any one government alone can solve these problems because again, what we do here in the US and what the Europeans do and what the Australians do and what the Asian countries do, because like Japan and South Korea and stuff are also being pretty aggressive on what they're willing to import in terms of carbon intensity of LNG and things like that as well. There was an effort through the DOE that, again, the DOE is not talking about, but I believe is still going on because, again, they understand the importance of this from an international trading and a US competitiveness point of view. But the DOE had an MMRV working group and they were working with industry, but they were also working with like 20 other governments to say, okay, look, how do we all agree what kind of standards are suitable so that we can actually trade. And that's the big piece that this comes back to. It's like, how do we make sure that this is compliant with like the World Trade Organization and like rules and requirements around that? And again, from the US's perspective, keeping US LNG competitive on a global market is key. Like Chris Wright did one of the keynotes at Gas Tech in Milan recently, because they're in Europe selling US gas, right? And so there is a role, I think, for governments to play.
Yeah.
But it's maybe more of a coordination role, maybe not necessarily a rule setting role. I don't know. I ranted on a lot.
No, it's helpful. So I'm gonna if you don't mind, I'm going to play cynical jerk face devil's advocate rebutter. Right? I'm gonna do that. All right. So you went through the governments, right, that are sort of increasing their participation to come to some sort of agreement. What you didn't say, what you didn't mention is China, India, Russia, and I'll even throw in Iran in there because those are the largest culprits in terms of emissions, right? I think it is a fair argument because I make this argument, so therefore it's fair. Like U.S. emissions has gone from 30% of the global total, give or take, 40 years ago to like 15%. The EU, and I'm throwing UK in there, so let's just say Europe, right? The broader Europeans. I know that, the UKers get...
UK is funny about it, but that's fine.
Yeah, they get weird. We're like, we're not in the EU. I'm like, I know. But then again, they can't name the other countries that aren't in the EU either. So it's like, you guys are hypocrites. EU is maybe 3%. So if you have, let's call it less than 20% of emissions doing all this stuff, and then you have the elephant in the room with China, Russia, and once again, sort of Iran, but not really. Let's just go China and Russia, where all their thing is just cost. Like, why should we sacrifice any sort of economic opportunity or even put in question our military standing, our social standing, our economic standing on a global scale when the probability of China and Russia doing anything remotely responsible with emissions is probably maybe 5%. I know China, people are like, oh, they just came out with new emissions goals. Like, I call bullshit immediately. They could care less. Like, so like the cynical jerk face rebuttal to your point, which I think is warranted, and I think and I agree with everything you said, but there's still like this big behemoth to deal with in the form of China and Russia.
Yep. I do think, and you threw India in there before,
Yeah.
and I think I was actually at a steel event in Singapore a couple of years ago. Actually, it wasn't even a couple of years ago. Time's a weird construct these days. I was at a steel event in Singapore, and didn't necessarily hear from the Chinese, but definitely heard from some of the Indian steelmakers around the idea of this challenge around, and this push and pull around low cost steel and green steel. And I hate stuff that's called green, because like, let's not call it green. Let's use carbon intensity numbers and stuff like that. But essentially steel made with an electric arc furnace instead of a traditional blast furnace.
Right.
Which is, we can get into the pieces of that. But because Europe had put in place CBAM at the time.
Yeah.
So Europe had come out with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Steel was one of the products. Again, this is where we have to start thinking about product supply chain, not just like individual assets and stuff around import into Europe. And again, the Indians that were at, there was one of the execs, I think from Tata Steel, was there and stuff like that. And they were talking about this challenge around like, we're trying to figure out how to do this cost effectively. We're trying to figure out like what penalties might look like. And I'd actually spoken to a steel exec in Europe, actually, just about 6 months before this, where they were really concerned about it as well, but the CBAM this is, but for different reasons. And one of the challenges, I think it's going to be really challenging, right? Because these economies, and you hear it a lot from other economies as well, where it's like, well, we should be allowed to grow and we should be allowed to do things cost effectively. And it's not an unfair argument. That it will be interesting to see how some of the force regulations in terms of their product are sort of sitting. And I do think it will change trade flows. And we've seen that. I mean, we saw that with oil, it wasn't from an emissions point of view, but because of nobody was allowed to buy Russian oil and stuff like that. And we just saw the trade flows change, right? Like, and so I think we'll see stuff happening in that regard. I think we'll see changing trade flows because of emissions regulations, which isn't necessarily then it's sort of a little bit counterproductive around trying to reduce emissions. Because like when the US Gulf Coast is talking about sending low carbon LNG to Asia, like that blows my mind. I'm like, that's ridiculous, because the journey itself is a long way. But it's, I don't know, I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but
yeah, go back and forth on this too. Like, I think, I mean, there's three things, right? To simplify this, I think the EU in particular, namely Germany, is a great blueprint for, hey, here are the consequences if you just go overboard, or if you're not really thoughtful, or if you don't have a long-term perspective on this. There are incredible economic ramifications which trickle down into societal ramifications, which does impact your global standing. And let's be a realist, like it's a much more volatile and much less sort of comforting world than it was 10, 15 years ago, whatever it is. The second component I would say is, I think we're in a modern day arms race with China. It is very clear that they want to be the top dog economically. And you see this from the growth of their military, and, they're putting up nuke facilities and, coal-fired power plants like it's going out of style, because they have this insatiable demand for energy.
Yeah.
The other component is, we just can't get out of our own way. Like the fact that we've had a static nuclear output since 1982, kind of embarrassing. The fact that it takes like 18 years, whatever it is, to build a nuclear facility, kind of embarrassing. So like, why would we prioritize emissions when there's just so many other problems? I'm not saying it's like this thing that you should just completely ignore, but whether it's permitting reform, or whether it's just getting the human capital needed to like build better nukes, more efficient nukes, SMR, whether it's like, hey, now we have this sort of Goliath dynamic with China sort of biting at our heels. Like all this stuff just gets really, really complex, really, really quick. And I don't think like anyone who says, well, we should just get rid of oil, gas, or, we need environmental controls. Like, I just don't I think they're playing checkers, not chess.
Yeah. No, and I think it is really challenging when we start saying, well, we're only going to do this, right? Like, and I use this example a lot, and I know you've heard me use this one before, but like, my husband and I have a property in Hawaii, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, but like Hawaii has like the highest electricity prices in the country. And it's because in order to power the grid, Hawaii burns diesel, which is insane. Like, it's absolutely bonkers. And so as we think about, and I go to that because for us, like, we will be off grid, we'll have solar. It's not worth us. Like, the solar is actually cheaper than it is to even connect to the grid to then have the privilege of paying the most expensive utility prices in the country. I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. So, again, when some of these things kind of happen, it's like, okay, well, how do we find the most efficient and the most cost effective? Exactly to your point. Like, and if some of those happen to be lower emissions, then great.
Yes.
Like, let's figure out where the efficiencies in the systems are and not necessarily force things. Because it's something that, like, because Hawaii has been really struggling to figure out their energy mix, they're starting to talk about going back to, burning of trees and stuff, like just like it's, and so there's a whole program on the island. I'm on the Big Island where you can like get free trees from the government because they're doing this like offset planting thing so they can grow enough trees to like burn for electricity. It's nuts. I'm like, let's just do solar and geothermal and hydro and like it'll be fine. And it also happens to be low emissions. Like, so it's and the same can then be said of natural gas and stuff, right? Like when we look at natural gas and how, like I say, how easy it is to connect, but it is in some places it's easy to get solar up and running. Like I have solar on my house here. It's great. Like Colorado gets a lot of sun. My electricity bill's low. It's fine. It works well for me, but we are still connected to the grid and I still have natural gas in my house. Like my furnace runs on natural gas. My cooking's on natural gas. Like, so it's still like, let's figure out what is efficient. And that's the challenge, I think. Like, how do we make sure that like there's some regulation, but to your point, like permitting for things has been a huge challenge. And, we need to put money into the right things as well. Like, like a lot of people with the IRA, like, oh, there's all this money for CCUS and all this kind of stuff. But the one that just drove me kind of a little bit crazy was the hydrogen stuff. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Like, you guys for how much money on hydrogen? Like, what? Like, it didn't make it, like, to be honest, it didn't make any sense to me. And like, there were so many people that were so excited about it. I'm like, this is so far off. Could it be a solution? Great. Is there an industry there? Yes. Should we be spending this much money on it? Absolutely not. Like, and so it's like, yeah, like that's the biggest thing, I think. How do we figure out efficient systems that work in places that need them, right? Like, and let's do that. And
the big argument that you hear is like speed and efficiency. We need speed and efficiency. It's like, well, I just think we're working backwards because we're preemptively picking winners in most cases. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, how do you sort of retrofit everything based on the winners that I want to see happen? Yeah. But it's like, just simplify the system, make it easier. The market will do whatever the market does, right? Because that's the most effective and efficient form. And in some places, Hawaii, solar done responsibly makes a ton of sense. Solar in Milwaukee, totally stupid. Geothermal in certain areas, wow, what an amazing idea. Geothermal in like other areas, like, like I even hear people like, we should have more hydro. It's like, bro, you live in Arizona. Like, what are you talking about? No. But and then basically on the efficiency too, and I'm not changing topics because I think it plays into this. Like, I do think the carbon markets are a necessary mechanism to enhance efficiency all around, because then, like, back to my point on incentive structures, like when you have that economic carrot that provides a financial reward for participating, it doesn't necessarily matter what the widget is. It's like, how do I get my hands on the widget and make it as effective and efficient as possible? Like, are you seeing carbon markets sort of becoming much more mainstream as opposed to like being sort of characterized as like the weird crypto guy sitting in his mom's basement doing like whatever?
There's actually lots to unpack there, because I think just quickly on like, there's a little bit on the like cost of carbon piece here in terms of like the efficiency piece, right? Because if it's more cost effective for a company to buy some carbon credits right now while they're still developing other bits and pieces and things like that, like there's a cost of capital allocation piece in here as well. That like there's all these companies building direct air capture at a huge expense, and it's like, well, that's again, your capital efficiency. And from a company point of view, I've heard from and spoken to a number of the large publicly traded firms and stuff like that, where it's like, we're spending all this capital and our shareholders are pissed about it because we don't see impact on our share price. We don't see a better like cost of capital from a lending point of view. And we don't see any price differentiation in the market. So like, again, like there's sort of some of that going on as well, because it will help if we think about then where we spend our money. It will help drive low cost solutions now, whether that is through the carbon markets and stuff, as other things are developing, so that we can be efficient. Anyway, the carbon market piece is interesting. Again, it's been really challenging in the carbon markets over the last few years. Going back to January of 23, when The Guardian put out their article that just trashed nature-based solutions. And since then...
But trashed it because it wasn't a penalty, in my opinion, to oil and gas, not because it didn't have financial potential or merit, which was ungodly irritating to me.
Yeah, but also trash them because it will. And I think for the first time, we talked right at the beginning about this tension between particularly the like carbon environmental, like EDF kind of folks and industry. I think for the first time, someone put a mirror up to the carbon folks and the environmental folks and went, "You're not doing this very well." Like, like what? And they had to kind of say, like, the carbon market industry had to sort of take a step back and be like, okay, we're trying, like, okay, what is the end goal? Like, how do we do this better? And so there's been a lot of like churn in the market right now around how do we think about, again, methodology, how do we assess, how do we calculate, that kind of stuff. So, that's been really challenging. And I think for companies, it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if it's an oil and gas company or if it's a Meta or a data, like a technology company, or if it's like United or SAP or anyone, right? Like buying credits on the voluntary carbon market kind of had a lot of risk to it, because if they didn't and they couldn't verify methodologies and suddenly the credits they bought were trashed and found to be not credible from a company reputation point of view, that was almost worse than not doing it. And so there was that, and some of that hasn't been 100% resolved to a certain extent. The piece that's been really interesting, and I think I'm also working with a company in this space right now, is sort of what are some of the other environmental instruments that are out there. The idea of credits and stuff for the use of renewable fuels, i.e. biodiesel and things like that, instead of traditional diesel and stuff like that. And can companies, how do companies show and get credit for that, right? And then can they trade those environmental attributes and stuff? And the answer is yes. And so there's a sort of this emergence of sort of other environmental certificates and environmental instruments is the word I was looking for. We're seeing, you mentioned water, like we're seeing water credits. I've heard about plastics credits and stuff around like, what does that look like? So there's a lot of really interesting things that are coming out that are over and above kind of carbon markets and stuff like that. That being said,
go on saying, because you're triggering me, but the way that I look at it is, if we are fundamentally reshaping our economy, which we are, like we are completely sort of turning it upside down. Now, net, I think it's a positive in the end, but I get so frustrated. It's like, well, we've always done it this way. It's like, dude, generative AI has really been around for like 2 years, 3 years. Like I just got into like ChatGPT meme creating 6 months ago. It's so much fun. I love it. I go overboard.
I love you. That's great.
They're so obnoxious, but they're so much fun to make. But in any case, like, because you are reshaping the economy for all intents and purposes, you need an entirely new set of solutions to manage and to make this new economic model as efficient as possible. And when you're talking about generative AI, like and we've said this ad nauseum, but what people don't think is these are some of the most resource intense mechanisms ever. Not ever. Like, it is the most resource intense. Like the water, the amount of water consumption, the amount of energy consumption, the amount of land consumption, like all this immense amount of consumption. Like, if it's not managed properly, or if there's not an efficiency built in, like it could actually be our demise. Like, I have this slide where it's like, it's a data center, but it's a caricature of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, right? Like, if done improperly, like, we are inherently screwed. And so, like, water management, land management, emissions management, all this stuff. I joke, it's not because we are like, hey, environmental Jesus is really, really cool. It's like, no, like, look at what we are doing. Like, we need a new infrastructure, a new mechanism to help ensure that we actually don't shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. And I think, again, it goes back to the efficiency thing, right? If we manage water really well, we'll probably reduce our emissions at the same time, right? Like, there's sort of some of this stuff that, and again, I've, spoken to folks within oil and gas companies about, like, some of the things that they're doing on their emissions management. And some of it's so simple. They're like, well, we just don't idle our engines as much. What a novel concept, right? Like, it's okay. Like, it's, some of it's so simple. And like, so the pace that's really fascinating to me on the carbon credit side, and you and I have talked about this a little bit before, but like the idea of finding what's the objective, right? Like, if the objective is to generate a carbon credit to reduce emissions, something like the orphan well credits that are happening should be an absolute no-brainer. For those that aren't familiar, there's like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of orphan wells around the US. Some, not all, are leaking methane, unfortunately. They're called orphan wells because, unfortunately, the companies that once operated them have gone out of business, and now they are property of the state, much like an orphan. And the states don't have enough money to go and plug these wells, never mind go and find them and all this kind of stuff. So, like, by definition, the carbon credit has to have additionality, which means there needs to be some sort of like financial mechanism that without it, this activity wouldn't happen. So that in of itself, the additionality piece on the orphan wells is huge, because without the money coming from carbon credits, again, the states don't have enough money to do this. And then there's permanence, and that the permanence piece is something that has been widely criticized in the carbon markets. Because again, like, how do you judge permanence from a forest? It's exceptionally difficult. And the idea of conserving forests and stuff, we should be conserving. Yeah. And like, we should be conserving forests. I'm a big national park geek. I love doing that. I live in Colorado. Like, great. But trying to measure that's really difficult. Measuring permanence on an orphan well, we go out and we see that it's leaking, and then we plug it and we can see that it's not. And then we can monitor it and see that it never leaks again, or if it does, we can fix it. Like, the permanence, so the risk around these kind of credits, it's solving a huge problem, which is methane, which has a higher global warming potential than CO2. It meets all the like requirements of both additionality and permanence. And yet there's this standoff around what it means, because like project developers and those in like, and it's not all again, I won't put everyone in there, but there's this tension of like people in the environmental space and project developers and things like that are like, well, we don't like these credits because it's just enabling oil and gas, or we're just cleaning up oil and gas.
They say that, like that is, you just played your hand, sir, because I know you were completely full of shit with your environmental sort of shenanigans. You don't care. You want to put the oil and gas business out of business, which is entirely different. And by the way, you need the oil and gas business to plug the methane problem. Yeah. Because if you get them out of business, then all the wells are abandoned, stupid.
Exactly. And like, and so, and it's exactly that, right? It's like, it's not actually about emission reduction. And
people go, yeah, stupid. Like, I'm in 5th grade. Sorry.
Yeah. And so like, there's this tension in the market, right? Of like, then, well, what, and again, it's not, anyway, it's really, it's difficult. I don't know what the solution is, but more and more conversations. And
it is tricky. And we'll figure it out. I mean, I think the one thing that we learned is we definitely, as I like to say, with really good guests, we need another session, right? Another hour. This could be like 4 hours.
Yeah. We'll just get everyone will be like, what are you
exactly. Like this 60 minutes flew. look, if people need to get a hold of you, if people need to find you, what's the best way to do it?
Yeah, you can find me on
Don't internet creep Deb. Let her give you her where do they find you?
Yeah. So I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. And then I've got my podcast that I put out. And you can find me on Substack as well under Navigating Carbon. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, Deb, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so
Well,
much. Yeah, just like Bob said, like besides all the other differences, we're basically the same person.
yeah.
Thank you for so much for coming on, and we'll be talking soon.
Right. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.